There are questions in history that refuse the mercy of sleep, questions that wake like wolves in the marrow when the wind turns cruel and the hearth runs low. Was Jon Snow the worst leader in Westeros, or merely the one most betrayed by the virtues that once set him apart? Some would forbid the inquiry on grounds of piety, for the boy who wore the world's sorrows upon his brow is a relic many hold sacred, and the dead are easy to sanctify. Yet a chronicle that shirks its duty is not a chronicle but a lullaby. The task before us is not to weigh affections but to measure consequence, not to hymn the nobility of intent but to audit the ledger of outcomes. We shall attempt no abstract indictment of a life, but an examination of a field, for the first proof in any case against greatness resides not in mottos spoken by fireside but in what armies did, where they bled, and which banners kept their color when the wind of steel blew hardest. Thus, beginning with care that is neither fawning nor cruel, we take as our opening tablet the cold plain beneath Winterfell, where a host of free folk, green levies, and northern diehards followed a commander who believed valor could wrest the future from a sadist's hands. This is the part to which we now turn. The battle men later named the Battle of the Bastards, a war morsel for minstrels and a study book for captains, a field on which one man's virtues cracked like pond ice under the weight of grief, and another's vices took the hard shape of victory until fortune, not generalship, reversed their course. Consider first the ground, for the earth knows nothing of righteousness and thus is the fairest judge. Winterfell lay ahead, its stones fat with memory, its banners stolen by the bastard of Bolton. The plain was broad and treacherous with last snows. The air was knife-cold, and the breath of men and horses rose like steam from a dying cauldron. On such ground, the ruler of the North would be not the man who loved his cause best, but the one who husbanded nerves, timed feints, and kept in reserve the one blow that mattered. Jon Snow stood with fewer spears than his foe. The host he commanded was a patchwork quilt, wildlings trained to a skirmisher's liberty that hates ordered ranks, Northmen pledged more to memory than to marching drill, a smattering of knights whose steel did not quite add up to a discipline of the old kind. The bastard opposite him wore around his army a belt of trenches and a shielded corps used to Ramsay's dog-law cruelty, in which hesitation was punished more promptly than defeat. It is one of the despairs of war that tyrants, by making obedience a kind of terror, sometimes rear formations that push when freemen would pause, an advantage temporary but real. Thus were the dice thrown. It has been argued that Jon's first error was strategic, not tactical, that he chose to fight a pitched battle he could scarcely afford to lose. Winter is a madness that eats storehouses and mothers alike. The hard logic would have counseled attrition, the gnawing down of Bolton patrols, the patience to lure treacherous houses back one by one with letters and hostages, the skirmish in dells and forests, not the tidy parade ground death that a predator like Ramsay longs to serve. In this, some allowance must be made to the chains around his choices. He lacked time, he lacked wheat, he lacked surety of allies, and each dawn that dawned with Rickon Stark in Ramsay's hands burned his men like a fever. Yet leadership is the art of bearing necessity as though it were desire. If there is blame to be weighed, it falls not upon the fact that he sought battle. Many commanders of higher renown have chosen worse fights, but upon how he then entered it, without making every sinew of the plain and every whisper of counsel serve as armor for his weakness in numbers. This brings us to the parley and the trap that followed. The bastard released the youngest Stark into the snow and bade him run, playing a child's game with a lord's cruelty. Jon Snow, whose heart had long made vows before his tongue could follow, gave chase, first with his eyes, then with his horse, then with the breath from his very marrow. We must not despise the human. The cords that bind kin cannot be spliced by lectures about war. Yet a commander's highest act of love is restraint, the refusal to squander the living in pursuit of the already lost. The counsel offered to him in the dark days before the battle, that Ramsay would peel back his mind like bark and find beneath it the fresh ring named brother, was not heeded. In that moment Jon ceased to be a general and became an elder sibling. The line between the two is as thin as a snowflake and as treacherous as ice upon a river. Rickon fell, as any man taught by war would have foretold, and Jon, murder in his blood and arrows in the sky, rode alone into the space between hosts. He did not only imperil himself, he bent his entire army toward his rescue, for there is no stubborn geometry like loyalty. A banner does not argue with a man's heart. It follows it, to glory or to ruin. There is a kind of courage that is the enemy of victory. Jon Snow possessed the sort that inspires songs, the front-facing gallantry that dares death to earn meaning for the living. But war is less moved by gallantry than by timing. Having thrown his center forward to rescue a solitary life already parceled to the grave, he forfeited lines he could ill afford to break. The vanguard surged, the reserve abandoned its reserve, the archers found their own companions in the line of fire and were made mostly useless by that most dreadful constraint: love of those directly in the way. Ser Davos, prudent when prudence could no longer be practiced, did what soldiers in such binds must do. He threw men forward to turn a paralyzing geometry back into motion. But motion was exactly what Ramsay desired of them. A foe who has arranged a field so that the more you move the closer you come to his teeth has already won half your battle for you. Every step Jon's men took toward their lord added a stone to the ring that would soon be closed around them. The bastard's shield wall is remembered by those who survived it as a traveling storm. It advanced with the ancient patience of infantry drilled to the rhythm of one cruel will. Spears bristled, shields overlapped, and the front gave ground only as a wave gives ground, to strike again where the sand's heart is weakest. This device is old, worthy of an inked plate in the annals, and Jon Snow must have read of it in the drafty quads of the wall. But reading is not remembering when the air turns to knives. He had no answer for it, no flank poised to scythe, no horse to unseam the formation, no hidden hedge of stakes to invite the storm to impale itself, no ravine to fix the foe while arrows rained. He had chosen a flat plain, and on a flat plain a patient phalanx is a grinder of men. He had, too, no certain ally upon whom he could model his plan. He had not bound Sansa's secret hope into the rhythm of his design, either because the hope had not been revealed or because his pride could not make room for cavalry he did not command. This is no small matter. Reserve is the soul of battle. If you have none, make one of time itself. Jon, pressed by hunger of heart and belly, did not. The encirclement came as winter always comes, with a silence that the dying mistake for calm. Body stacked upon body, breath stealing breath, a mortality not of blades but of lungs failing under the weight of comrades. The hill of the dead grew around the living, a curved shore on which Jon's host gasped and beat like fish. Here a commander earns either his epitaph or his coronation. It is in these slow suffocation rooms that a leader's mind must be colder than the steel that seeks him. Jon's mind, so far as the surviving tongues tell it, became the fulcrum of a single desire: to reach the bastard, to find the throat that had laughed over the boy's death and stop it forever. Such crystalline purpose makes saints and suicides, but it does not turn a phalanx aside. In the ring, he fought like the myth his friends already believed him to be, and in fighting like a myth, he nearly died like one. Sansa Stark's counsel had not been the counsel of a tactician but of a survivor who understood her enemy as one recognizes a nightmare one cannot quite wake from. Shed the hope of saving the boy, she had warned. He will make your heart an instrument against you. Wait, amass, harden, if you can. Trust nothing, least of all mercy. Jon heard and did not listen, or listened but could not translate warning into act. It is the well-meaning tragedy of commanders reared upon oaths that when the problem before them is a man without oaths they reach for a sword when the only tool needed is time. We shall not ignore the harsh arithmetic. Time was a luxury his larders could not afford. His host a tapestry whose stitching might not survive another unraveled month. Yet had he made a fortress of his weakness, had he let the bastard's hunger to resolve the matter bring him to ground of Jon's choosing, had he dared to hold his fire until the enemy overreached, perhaps a smaller field could have devoured a larger cruelty. Perhaps not. Historians are great at cutting cloth already measured. A commander must sow while the wind is howling. In judgment we must separate three strands: the battlefield plan, the battlefield heart, and the battlefield luck. Of the plan little can be said in praise beyond the hope that intention might transmute inferiority of numbers into superiority of spirit. He arranged his forces on open ground that favored the enemy's discipline. He used his vanguard to answer a trap rather than a design. He allowed his archers no lane of murder and his horses no depth from which to break a line. He fought the field presented to him rather than creating a new one with stratagem or delay. This is failure. Of the heart, we can give him the laurel fate denied many. His courage did not break. He held himself where horror was a sea and did not drown in it by choice, only nearly by circumstance. This is honor, and it should be named honor, for our judgments are not served by smallness. Of luck, we must speak with humility but also with clarity. The Knights of the Vale arrived like weather, and their charge remade the world. There is a lesson here that highborn boys are rarely taught and lowborn boys rarely forget. Gratitude to fortune is no defense of merit. Jon's victory was delivered on lances he did not command, sprung from a letter he did not send, urged by a player he did not trust with cause to spare neither him nor his enemy if the wind changed. He was, in that hour, beneficiary of a cavalry miracle that justifies neither his lines nor his choices, that he turned at once to the work remaining, breaking Winterfell's gate, battering through with one's last breath, and striking the bastard down, speaks to stamina, to the iron woman behind him, and to the stubborn animal in men who have been shown the dead and refuse to lie down among them. But when we trace cause and consequence, the blade that felled Ramsay Bolton had first been tempered by a rescue not of the general's making. From the vantage of those who survived, the costs are counted in names now lost in snow. Houses that could ill afford to bleed bled, and the free folk, who had staked their future on a southern lord's promise of shelter beyond a wall of men instead of a wall of ice, paid in sons. The giant's blood steamed like a libation on Winterfell stones. It is the giant's cruel fate to die beneath gates they were born to break. The North did receive its castle back, and the Bolton banners did come down. Sansa Stark fed the bastard to his own hounds. Justice made a tidy line, as justice sometimes does when it has an executioner of its own. Yet, in the ledger of leadership, the sum is not simply castle minus tyrant. It is also men minus men, ground chosen minus ground endured, plan minus miracle. The arithmetic is sharper than a sword. Jon Snow placed his army in a position where, without an ally's timely lance, it would have been mown to a memory. Now, there are those who cry that this is unfair, that a commander must be spared a harsh audit when the foe is exceptional in cruelty and cunning. But war's coldest rule is that the enemy's cruelty and cunning are facts like weather. You plan under the same sky you fight beneath. Jon knew, or was told, that Ramsay would play him as harpists play strings, tugging emotion until it sang the tune he wanted. He therefore ought to have formed a plan that refused the performance altogether. He might have refused the open plain and set instead a siege of hunger, not of Winterfell, which was stocked, but of Ramsay's need to parade a victory before the North before winter sealed roads and loyalties. He might have harried the Bolton foraging parties, burned the meat they could not hold, poisoned the air with uncertainty. He might have moved his men at night and rested by day, using the river shallows and copses to make pursuit costly. He might have withdrawn from the parley and dared to be called coward, teaching his followers that courage sometimes is the backbone that endures the carpentry of scorn. He did none of these. We shall concede that many of these are counsels whose plausibility fades once you step into the boots of hunger and the cloak of a brother's peril. Yet leaders are precisely those who bear such boots and cloaks without letting either determine the next step. One might ask whether Jon's failures on this field were accidents of temperament or the culmination of a pattern. His virtue is the virtue of the vow. He binds himself quickly, and then he binds others to the consequence. In the ring of shields, a vow is a rope that pulls a host together. In the snare of a sadist's theater, the same rope is seized and used to pull that host into knots. Jon trusted to the combat of champions, to the parley of men, to the possibility that Ramsay might be moved by displays of steadiness or manhood. He did not understand that some foes interpret restraint as permission. A king of winter must lack the chink that shows his heart to a hawk. Our subject did not lack it, and the hawk struck. That he rose from the blow is gallant and ghastly both, for many did not rise with him. There is also the matter of counsel. He had beside him not only his own courage but minds practiced in narrower arts. Davos Seaworth, who understands that numbers are the bones of luck, Sansa Stark, who understands wolves and the men who hunt them. Wildling chieftains, who understand that a flat plain is a grave if you do not own its edges. Good counsel is water, you may drink it without making it your blood. Yet, after the parley, he drank instead from a well of rage. Rage is a poor water in winter. If we must name the error in terms a student of the Citadel would carry away. He confused moral clarity with tactical clarity, and in doing so ceded to his enemy both the hour and the hill. When the Vale lances struck, a new geometry bloomed. The ring became a crescent, the crescent a rout. Cavalry broke the phalanx because cavalry is a letter many infantry formations have never learned to read. The bastard fled to stone and died in a stone room like the dog he had trained other dogs to be. Jon and Sansa stood upon the snow that steaming bodies had turned to mud and claimed the North's hearth as a place for old songs again. Here the chronicler must perform an act of fairness often mistaken for softness. To say that a bad plan that ends in a good cause achieved is not thereby transmuted into a good plan. The god of battles is capricious. Sometimes he pities fools, sometimes he chastises sages. Always he keeps his own counsel. The art of history is to leave his altar empty and write only of men. From this field, a chain trails into later sorrows. The host that left Winterfell's plain alive was smaller than the one that had marched upon it. To fill the gaps, Jon would later forge an alliance with a queen from fire and storm, binding the snow of the north to dragons that do not winter well. Had he kept his host stronger by caution here, he might have negotiated from a chair rather than from supplication. Had he demonstrated the cool architecture of patience in his first trial as a would-be lord of the north, he might have taught his followers the difference between bravery and stewardship. Instead, even in victory, he rehearsed for them a pattern that would echo through halls and into thrones, the heart leaping where the head must weigh. If we ask whether this battle proves him the worst leader in Westeros, the accusation collapses under the weight of names who led worse. There are princes who bartered away fleets for vanity, kings who made bonfires of their people's lives to warm prophecies, lords who mistook treachery for statecraft until no one remained to betray them. Jon Snow, by contrast, spent his men for a hearth that offers warmth to more than those who feasted with him. Yet the task is not to excuse by comparison but to calibrate by consequence. The hardest charge against him on this day is not that he risked all, but that he risked all for reasons he could not control. A commander should prefer forces he can summon to miracles he can pray for. He went to war with prayers in his bones and found that battles, unlike gods, answer slow and often with someone else's voice. That the North bent the knee to the Stark cause after the battle is the other half of truth. Men and women are not abacuses. They do not add only numbers but also narratives. They saw a man ride into slaughter for a child, and in that ride they found a crown even before winter's snows had time to hide the mistakes. The victory of this tale is not merely that the castle fell but that the people felt they had witnessed a myth reborn. Legends are currencies, and Jon Snow minted much that day. Leaders may spend legends to buy loyalty, and for a season it pays handsomely. The pauper's truth, however, is that legends cannot pay the freight of a long war. When the cost of earlier errors comes due, one must answer with grain, with treaties, with knowledge of men more than with knowledge of oneself. What, then, is our measured verdict upon this field? Jon Snow's leadership at the Battle of the Bastards was poor in plan, noble in heart, and redeemed in outcome by an intervention he did not command. He failed where a leader must be hardest. He let his enemy decide the terms. He surrendered the time that could have been his ally. He allowed love to dictate maneuvers better left to calculation. He also stood where others would have bent and did not let terror turn his bones to wax. The North received back a home because a sister would not let a brother drown, because a wily lord loved his own advantage more than he loved maintaining a tyrant, and because men in steel, summoned by an unsteady promise, found themselves at the right hill at the right hour. In the quiet that followed, Sansa's eyes told the rest of the story, that power prefers the patient and will not forever endure being led by ardor. On that day, Jon won a song and spent a fortune of lives. The song would crown him. The debt would find him later. If he was not the worst leader in Westeros, it is because the land has known depravity in command that he could neither imagine nor stomach. If he was not the best, It is because he trusted too much in the alchemy by which suffering becomes wisdom without passing through the crucible of strategy. And so the introduction concludes as all fair introductions must, by narrowing a question rather than pretending to settle it. Was Jon Snow the worst leader? On this first field, the just answer is no. The more piercing answer is that he flirted with a kind of worstness that is most dangerous of all, the honorable catastrophe, lovely to behold and ruinous to follow. The pages ahead, which will unfurl through other rooms of his rule, will decide whether this pattern was broken or repeated, whether the heart learned the grammar of power or whether it kept singing until the hall itself burned from the beauty of the note. The tale of treason at Castle Black is best begun not with blades but with ballots, for mutiny is the harvest of seeds sown in quieter seasons. When Jon Snow first took the Black, he learned that the Night's Watch was a monastery built atop a graveyard, its discipline borrowed from a world that no longer sent its sons of sound stock. When he was raised to command, it was not by a chorus of one voice but by a collage of factions, old rivals softened by the wall's wind, converts won by the eloquence of a single steadfast friend, and grudging men who thought the bastard would do until a better man returned from the snows. This was legitimacy sufficient to act, yet not enough to reform, and the difference between those two authorities is the measure by which many lords have been swallowed by their own tables. He entered office with debts he did not acknowledge, and with enemies he preferred to conquer by example rather than by the patient craft of binding pride to purpose. In the Watch there is a law older than law. Every man believes himself a guardian of the last civilized flame, and such guardians take insult as if it were invasion. Jon's failure lay not first in the mercy he showed the free folk, nor in the ferocity he showed a coward, but in misjudging the altitude at which principle can fly without losing sight of the hearths it is meant to warm. By the time Stannis Baratheon's banners crowded the yard with their burn scars and iron faith, Jon had a choice that would have shamed a wiser heart: the realm's quarrels or the realm's border. He chose the border, refusing the honeyed sin of legitimacy offered by a southern king, Winterfell and stark and right written in red wax, because he had sworn a poor man's oath and thought a poor man's oath more royal than any parchment. This choice was sound in the language of vows and ruinous in the dialect of politics. Stannis remained a guest of sorts, an icebound sovereign whose presence taught the Watch to see itself as a court with lords and favorites again. The old hardness of the black cloak softened into cliques. Jon could no longer be merely Lord Commander. He must be a chancellor, a quartermaster of meaning, a priest of morale. He was learning a new alphabet while the northern sky set its ink. Winter. The first crack sounded like justice. Janos Slynt, who had once cowered in a dark corner while braver men died at the wall and then spat upon orders to take up a ruined castle and make it whole, found himself in the snow before an executioner whose sword had learned both mercy and law from a better man now dead. Jon did not relish killing, nor did he flinch. He offered command, then consequence. The man refused, and the blade fell. This episode has been recounted as the cornerstone of Jon's authority. And so it was for those who loved him already. For those who mistrusted the bastard, it was a spectacle of lordship unbecoming a brother. The Watch was not accustomed to watching its own beheaded in the yard like criminals before a crowd. In a company of exiles, the rituals of shame are as vital as the rituals of courage. Public death rewrote the balance between commander and commanded. The justness of the act is not in question. The fit of the act to the fragile polity is. He proved the steel of his arm, and in proving it, carved a new trench between those who valued law as he did and those who feared they might someday be the next example. Even boys are counted in these economies. The lad who watched with furious eyes saw not justice but the head of his dead village rolling in the snow all over again. What followed was the finest intention of his life and the poorest politics of it. Jon remembered the dead as they truly are, not enemies, but an arithmetic that makes all men equal once counted. He had seen the army that does not bargain and cannot be bought. He knew that the free folk were not raiders now but refugees from a tide with no mercy in it. He resolved to open the gate and invite into the very heart of his order the people it had for centuries called foe. On the page of the world, this was enlightened statecraft. In the barracks it read like blasphemy. Bowen Marsh, a steward whose power was measured in salted pork and dried peas, counted stores with a miser's dread, and saw that charity spends not only coin but also consent. Alliser Thorne, a soldier whose honor was stratified like old ice, smelt in the wildlings' smoke the ruin of a culture that had turned scorn into armor. To him, admitting the free folk did not save the watch, it undid it. The rankers, scarred by raids or taught by fireside tales to fear the painted men beyond the trees, watched the gate's hinges work for the wrong faces and felt the story of their order crack. Jon told them the truth that should have sanctified his policy, that the dead come for all, that living blood must be husbanded no matter its language, and found that truth has poor feet when it must walk across centuries of hate without accompaniment. He needed more than argument. He needed rights. He did not fashion them. He might have gathered every brother beneath the wall and sworn, in a single thunderous rite, the recalibrated oath. I will guard not the realm of men against men, but men against the bitter night. He might have placed wildling chieftains on their knees before the statues in the cold sept and made them swear, not to the seven nor to the old gods, but to the wall itself, binding symbol to fear and making obedience feel like continuity rather than exposure. He might have demanded hostages of the free folk while giving them land, the old coin of trust minted anew. He might have paired each rangy free folk warband with a seasoned black brother for joint patrols, mixing blood and duty until prejudice had to fight in both directions at once. Instead, pressed by urgency and the knowledge of oncoming death, he opened the gate and expected reality to do what religion and ritual are designed to do: convince the heart by means other than proof. Hardhome sharpened everything. In one telling, Jon sailed into the storm and returned with horror crystallized in his eyes and proof written across the water. A shore emptied by cold thunder, a host of dead standing like a grotesque review. In another, he moved pieces on a board that the watch had not agreed was even the right board, sending messages through channels that smelled to the old guard like collaboration with an enemy too long hated to forgive. In either case, he brought back not only lives but a narrative that demanded the men of the watch abandon their ancestral catechism in one breath. He showed bone-white truth and expected fear to make allies out of old grief. It does not work so. Fear needs shepherding. It can either stampede into violence or knit men together carefully over shared embers. Jon returned grim, righteous, determined, and tired. He had not yet learned how to make tiredness look like trust. As the free folk were placed in the gift and fed from stores that winter had earmarked for black cloaks, the tears in the fabric widened. Horses that had belonged to dead brothers were now under wildlings. Fires in the yard spoke languages that insulted old scars by their mere existence. Jon did punish wildling offenses, but not with the theater he had used to break Slint. The imbalance was felt, not counted. Men do not keep ledgers of fairness with ink. They keep them with stories, and the story was that the Lord Commander loved the enemy and endured his own. Rumor is an army that never sleeps. Alliser stoked it. Bowen feared it. Boys like Ollie breathed it until jealousy and grief hardened into doctrine. Jon stood upon the ramparts with the weight of the true enemy on his shoulders and did not notice that the false enemy, his brother's memory of themselves, had slipped his hand. He also made the ancient administrative mistake of behaving as if authority renews itself simply by existing. After the execution in the yard, he could have spent a month doing nothing but mending honor planks, sharing bread at the small tables, listening to the petty law of the commons, inventing ceremonies that gave the old guard a role in the new order they had not chosen. He could have turned Alliser into a hero of the transition, assigning him visible guardianship of some cherished custom to disguise the reality that the custom had been reinterpreted beyond recognition. He could have given Bowen Marsh 2 new warehouses and the power to say no to every request for grain except those Jon himself countersigned in public. A steward whose fears are recognized will fight for you against his own. He did some of these things in half measures, to be fair, and half measures in monasteries are fuel for zealotry, not cures for it. There remains the matter of vows. In the book-bound telling, the letter written in pink ink is either a jest of devils or a summoning to honor disguised as insult. Jon, stung by the news it carried, determined to march south, to break, for cause, the sentence he had sworn with his own mouth. One can argue that he had already broken it in spirit by reshaping the Watch's mission, but that is a sophistry. Every institution must evolve or fall. Marching on a lord of the realm with brothers of the watch at your back was not evolution, it was revolution. The mutineers found in that announcement not just a policy to oppose but a scripture to enforce. Even a lax creed will draw blood if you stab it often enough. In the showbound telling, the choice was less about marching and more about admitting, feeding, and arming those whom the watch had long been formed to repel. In both tellings, the mutiny's casus belli was the same. Jon had driven his company beyond its myth faster than the souls within it could follow. At last the knives found him. The ritual they crafted was perfect in its cruelty, a sacrament of betrayal dressed as duty. For the watch, they said, and in those words made themselves priests of a god they believed Jon had abandoned. His body swallowed steel again and again, and among those who delivered the sacrament was a boy whose grief had been cultivated into orthodoxy by men too proud to name their envy and too frightened to name their fear. Bowen wept, so it is said, because stewards love what they manage and fear what they cannot count, and Jon had asked him to count tomorrows rather than turnips. Alistair's face was a tattoo of old injury. In Jon he saw every lord's son who had ever treated him like a hard wall for a softer hand to lean on. The blows they dealt were personal, but they believed them principled. This is the blind spot of men who live inside oaths and never ask who wrote them. Was the mutiny, then, the verdict on his leadership? It was a verdict on one element of it: his failure to convert the institution that served him into a servant of the world he had seen. He told them the truth and mistook his own conviction for a contagion. He made martyrs of his enemies and symbols of his policies in the wrong order. First the axe, then the amity. First the shock, then the catechism. First the hungry arrival, then the plan. He underestimated the work of myth-making in a place where myth feeds the fires. He forgot that the watch's strength is not men upon a wall but men within a story, and he tried to rewrite the story without giving its custodians a role in the authorship. A commander who cannot persuade must at least domesticate opposition. He did neither, believing the imminence of death a sufficient tutor. Death, alas, is a slow schoolmaster until the day it graduates everyone at once. And yet, there is mercy in the ink. The same clarity that made him a poor politician made him a faithful guardian of humankind. He understood the boundary between the living and the dead to be holy and refused to let prejudice stand like a scarecrow on a grave. What he lacked in the arts of cooptation he possessed in the courage to look at the ugliest arithmetic and pay it. Many a lord would have let the wildlings die and called it prudence, and then later written sermons about fate when the winds carried screams over their battlements. Jon chose the sin of his brother's eyes so that their children might know any eyes at all. If he was punished for it, the punishment was real in its own terms but false in the court that matters, the court of winters to come. What might he have done differently within the compass of necessity? He could have staged his revolution as continuity, not rupture. He could have elevated Alistair to be master of the gate, granting him public control over who entered and under what rights, thus turning the enemy of the policy into its visible guarantor. He could have introduced hostages not as chains but as wards, children fostered at Castle Black who learned letters from old sergeants and taught their mothers that the watch wished to be uncle rather than overlord. He could have created a black cloak and bone token, a small physique of symbolism. Every brother paired with a free folk ally, each saving the other's life in staged but earnest winter drills, retold nightly until story transformed suspicion. He could have spent 1/10 of his time on logistics and 9/10 on liturgy, for in a brotherhood liturgy is logistics. He could have held back the axe on Slint and chosen the leper's sentence, banishment beyond the wall under guarded escort, thus teaching mercy without the theater that alienates the half-convinced. None of these alone would have saved him. Together they might have bought the one coin reformers always lack: time. In the larger reckoning, the mutiny shows him not as the worst leader but as the most exposed one. The worst leaders hide their cowardice behind pageantry and allow lesser men to die for small ideas. Jon did the reverse. He exposed himself for a great idea and let pageantry rot. His flaw was that he thought seeing the true enemy gave him the right to neglect the false friends. Men are not ideas. They are winters that must be fed, fears that must be spoken to in their mother tongues. He loved humanity in the aggregate and sometimes forgot to love his brothers in the particular. Those particular men, with their petty injuries, their romantic hatreds, their need to be persuaded rather than told. A commander who does not seduce his institution will one day be stabbed by it, and the knives will all be inscribed with the same justification, for the thing we thought we were. Thus the mutiny stands in our chronicle as the consequence of good sense expressed without good ceremony, of moral courage unaccompanied by the politics that gives moral courage a long life. If we are to weigh Jon Snow by this night alone, we find him guilty of a reformer's haste and a monk's pride, innocent of malice, and elevated nevertheless by the scale of his concern. He tried to move a mountain with a sermon. The mountain replied with stone. The story ahead will show whether the stones remember what they have done when the winter they feared begins to eat its own tail. For now we leave him in the snow, between the oath that killed him and the oath he refused to betray, a man who learned that the wall is not only ice stacked against the wild but also habits stacked against the new. There are rulers whose fault is appetite and others whose fault is abstinence. Yet the earth is just to neither when winter comes. Jon Snow belongs to the second company. A man who starved his politics to feed his conscience, who prized the clean line of a vow over the crooked bridges by which men pass from principle into safety. It is the habit of minstrels to praise such men, and perhaps the world would perish without a few. But kingdoms are not ballads. They are granaries and hostages and ceremonies, and they must be fed with something grittier than the air of righteousness. To judge him by this measure is not to despise him. It is to take his chosen coin and weigh it against the costs he himself declared worth paying. We have seen him misplay the plain outside Winterfell. We have watched him fail to make a monastery into a nation at the edge of the world. Now we must mark the seam that clasps those errors together. The preference for honor when the hour demanded craft. The decision to accept a true thing even when the telling of it turned the future's hinge the wrong way. It began, as many tragedies begin, with a crown he would not touch because another oath already touched his brow, and with a letter he would not write because another man's cruelty had written one for him. When a southern king, hard as iron and brittle as prophecy, offered Jon the thing his blood had been denied, Winterfell in name, not merely in ache, he answered with the catechism of the Black Cloak. It was not a foolish catechism. The watch does not survive on convenience. Yet he did not so much weigh the vow as wear it like armor against possibility. Had he accepted the legitimization and left the wall with formal leave, he might have welded the North to a purpose under his name at a time when the North would have preferred even a half-stark to a whole winter. He might have stitched grain and fealty to the cause of the living under a banner whose dyes did not run when the South's politics reigned. He could have reinterpreted the oath as guardianship over a broader hearth. Realm of men is elastic when the cold presses its thumb into your ribcage. Instead, he refused the parchment and kept the purity of a monk. This is admirable in the song and costly in the ledger, for once refuse becomes habit, it begins to make choices on its own. Honor then took oars in hand and rowed him into Hardhome's black surf. The crossing itself was a piece of moral geometry almost Euclidean in its clarity. Men are men, and the dead eat all, therefore one must save what can still be saved. But the proof breaks down at the axiom of politics, where lines turn to people with memories. He risked not only himself but the authority of his office in a place of uncertain command to keep a bargain whose witnesses would be grateful but not yet loyal, and in doing so he made his own house vulnerable to men for whom gratitude is a weak mortar. He returned with life in his boats and the night in his eyes and discovered, too late, that the perfect logic of compassion is not persuasive in a monastery whose faith has been curated by fear. The decision was right in the language of souls and wrong in the dialect of power. The dialect matters because without it souls become corpses that write their own rebuttals upon the snow. The same principle guided his sword when he raised it over traitors and his hand when he opened the gate for former enemies. He performed both acts as if the crowd before him were a tribunal of gods interested only in coherence. A man who refused orders would taste the law's iron, and a people who could swell the ranks of the living would be sheltered by the living's defenders. He was correct on both counts, and also wrong in both theaters, because the human material around him was not a jury of principles but a chorus of needs, egos, and ceremonies. He punished without pageantry where pageantry might have soothed, and he transformed a centuries-old border without inventing a new liturgy to replace the devotions he broke. Honor does not speak in trumpets unless someone writes it music. He presumed the instrument would find its own notes. His enemies brought drums. If this were all, he might be acquitted as a saint miscast as steward. But the deeper pattern unfolded when the dead's shadow stretched over a city that loved its lies. In the dragon pit, before a ruined menagerie whose fossils testified to extinct majesties, he was asked to play politics with language, to ritualize a falsehood for the sake of a true peace. He refused. He declared fealty where silence would have sufficed. The gesture became a sermon no one had requested and several could not tolerate. A queen whose pride was a blade turned away. A counselor was forced to bargain in shadows to recover what a single withheld word would have secured. And the fragile union against annihilation was built not on trust but on a trick. Words must mean something, he believed, and in a just world they would. In a dying world they must sometimes mean enough later. He would not defer the truth even to rescue it, and so truth was rescued behind his back with a counterfeit that emboldened a liar to assume she could counterfeit her way through the end of days. He repeated the gesture of uncompromising candor when the sea had nearly taken him and a dragon's fire had nearly saved him. Bent by wounds and the weight of what he had seen in ice, a theology of survival written in blue fire, he bent the knee to the breaker of chains. The choice can be defended on several fronts. Gratitude is a currency kings spend too little. Unity against winter cannot be minted from distrust. And he admired in her a steel which, at that hour, he believed would ring to the right tune if struck by the needs of the innocent. Yet the timing of the oath undid its wisdom. He gave away a nation's bargaining chip before he had prepared that nation to live without it. He made a gift of the North that the North had not signed, and then he expected the North to discover its consent retroactively upon the return of spring. Honor is an impatient donor. Politics is a slow receiver. The list of moral decisions that became tactical strikes against his own cause lengthens like winter shadows. He accepted a suicidal errand to bring a single captive horror before a queen of perfidy, as if evidence were the currency of a woman who minted reality at will. He led champions into a maw that snapped shut on them like a steel jaw under snow, and though the flight of dragons made theater of salvation, the spear of the night unmade one of the world's scarcest assets and delivered it, apostate and aflame, to the enemy. The wall, which neither treachery nor treaty had yet punctured, fell to a blue fire forged in that errand's consequence. The moral arithmetic had felt pure in the tent where it was drawn. Show them, that they may know, that they may join, that we may live. And in the field it proved catastrophic. Not merely because good men paid in blood, but because the instrument of the enemy's greatest breach was the loss purchased by Jon's insistence on arguing the truth with proof rather than with power. There are times when it is not wicked to let your enemies believe with less than the full measure of demonstration. He preferred the tyranny of honesty to the hazard of faith and learned that the dead do not grade on a curve. Nor did he spare himself the rigors of disclosure when the secret of his blood burned like a sealed candle in a cold room. In the God's Wood, under the tree that remembers everything men forget, he offered his sisters a truth that could not remain in a single bowl. He knew, or should have known, that truth loves the air. It wandered from leaf to hall to chamber, where it met two counselors whose trades were nation and necessity. The revelation cracked a coalition already choked by pride and hunger and fear, and it armed the worst story about him in the mind of the Dragon Queen, that he was a usurper who did not even want the throne he threatened by breathing. His defenders will answer that secrecy breeds rot, that families do not thrive upon lies, and that the North deserved to know why the wolf's bearing felt suddenly like a king's. All this is sound, and all this ignores the basic condition of politics, which is that timing and custody are the ribs that protect truth's heart. He opened that heart in a place where knives were being sharpened. Thus we come to the bell and the fire, in the shadow of King's Landing's towers, beneath the ribs of a city that had long learned to inhale cruelty and exhale coin. He rode in the service of a queen he had legitimated with his knee and his counsel. He begged for mercy, and when the bell tolled, for one blessed moment the city became a parable in which surrender could end the calculus of cruelty. The parable broke under dragonfire. Jon did not order the flames. He tried, in the radius of one man's voice and steel, to turn a river back with a cup. Yet the blaze was the child of a union he had consecrated. It was born of promises he had made to a woman collapsing under grief and suspicion, of a campaign whose legitimacy had leaned upon his renown among northern soldiers and southern smallfolk alike. In that hour, honor took the strangest face. He forbade his men to rape and murder, and they obeyed him where they could hear him, one island of decency in a sea that did not answer to human law. The spectacle is almost unbearable. The good man carrying a candle through a storm he helped invite into the valley, sheltering what souls he could in the lee of his own shadow, while the city learned what happens when dragonfire replaces diplomacy. What followed was an act of honor so absolute that it became a severing of history. In the shattered ribcage of a hall built to domesticate power with iron chairs and storied swords, he held a queen who had eaten the city to make the world safe for her idea of gentleness, and he ended her as gently as a man can end anyone with steel. He chose not only against love but against the polity his own fealty had raised from fear. He chose to cut the Gordian knot with a blade instead of trusting that time would loosen it before it strangled everyone. Many will bless him for it to the end of days. Some will curse him for not having seen the storm earlier, when counsel could still have been surgery rather than execution. The judgment belongs to winter, which does not explain itself. The trail of these decisions is not littered with malice, but with purity piled into drifts too high for ordinary men to climb. He was not a liar when lying would have saved legions. He was not a usurper when usurpation, however justified, would have curdled the fragile broth of alliance into something drinkable. He was not a conspirator when conspiracy might have made mercy practicable before it had to be murder. He preferred the clean wound now to the infected compromise later and discovered that both kill, but only one breeds allies. It is not that honesty was wrong. Honesty is never wrong in the cosmos where gods measure hearts, but that he misjudged the human weather into which he exposed it. He practiced a theology of leadership in a land that rewards pagan craft. He was a saint with a sword in a century that required saints with ledgers. If we ask whether this recurring preference for honor over expediency endangered his people, the answer is as delicate as hoarfrost and as blunt as a cudgel. Yes, because soldiers died obeying orders shaped more by his need to remain himself than by their need to remain alive. Yes, because alliances that might have endured were throttled by truths that could have waited a season. Yes, because enemies who required manipulation were confronted instead with virtue, which they interpreted and exploited as weakness. But also no, because without his stubborn refusal to make a shrine of convenience, the living might have dissolved into the petty kingdoms that winter devours one by one. No, because his unwillingness to bend words saved his followers from one of the secret poisons of war, the creeping belief that oaths are costumes. No, because his final crime against love made a hearth for children in a city that had forgotten the smell of bread. He endangered his people in the short term to honor a longer line than dynasties can draw. History hates this bargain until it has spent its anger. Then it calls it wisdom when it suits the victors to pretend they planned it. Still, even the fairest defense must grant that virtue can be trained. A man need not become a liar to learn the didactics of silence. He need not become a usurper to learn the calculus of leverage. He need not become a conspirator to learn how to break a fever with a dose of theater. Jon could have kept his scruples and bolted them to ceremony as one bolts a door to a house of many rooms, by inventing rituals that gave truth a clock, by staging promises so that the slow could believe they were not being hurried to a cliff's edge, by reserving a private sanctum for the confession that a single sentence, unsaid today, might deliver a city next week. He might have recognized that honor is not a substance but a choreography. The sequence of steps by which a moral intention crosses a floor crowded with rivals and arrives at the far wall still recognizable to itself. He often chose to sprint straight-backed through that crowd. The elbows and knives and goblets did what they always do to sprinters. We end this movement of the chronicle in the place where all his dilemmas were crowned. A half-emptied realm, a half-emptied man, a balance restored by measures that do not look like triumph. He was sent back to the cold to wear again the cloak that had first taught him how heavy an idea can be when it is soaked through with history. If this is defeat, it is the noblest kind. If it is victory, it is the kind that wears sackcloth. He did not learn to lie, and for that children may be warming their hands over fires their grandparents would never have lived to see. He did not learn to scheme, and for that he carried more bodies in his arms than he otherwise might have. The sentence is the same both times. He did not learn. Whether this makes him the worst leader or merely the purest instrument through which winter taught the living how to survive without becoming monsters is a question the next Snows will answer. For now, it is enough to say that he was a man who put truth where tactics ought to stand and then stood there himself, and by standing, he either saved us from our cleverness or proved that cleverness is the highest charity of all. The oath is the spine of the watch, and the watch is the hinge of the realm, and hinges do not argue with doors. They hold. When men in black recite that their watch begins, that they shall live and die at their post, that they take no wife and father no children and wear no crowns, they perform a magic older than the citadel's metals and subtler than any maester's chain. They turn many errant lives into a single body that can resist winter. A leader of the watch does not merely enforce these words. He breathes them until his breath becomes the wind that keeps that body moving. If he ever treats the oath as a garment to be put on or shed according to weather, the wind falters, and the many lives recall they were separate. The question before us is not whether Jon Snow loved the oath. He did, but whether he broke it when love for other things pushed against its boards, and whether those breaks were the faults of a man or the necessities of an age that made old words brittle. It is a colder question than the one minstrels prefer, because it asks not about purity of motives but about continuity of order. To lead the watch is to be a custodian of a continuity that outlives you. To break the oath is to admit that even the strongest bridge must sometimes be jumped from. The record of Jon's years at the wall reads like a ledger of such jumps. We will not scold a man for learning what he could only learn by falling. We will trace what the falling cost. At first, the oath sat on him like armor and like a hair shirt. He was the kind of recruit the watch was built to cultivate. Stern to himself, stubborn toward his own desires, earnest in a way that turns flogging into a form of prayer. He rose quickly under eyes that admired his hardness and envied it. Then came the hard school beyond the wall, where Corin Halfhand, old wolf of the frost, made of the young man a blade to be thrust into the wildling host. What followed looks, at a glance, like a betrayal of brotherhood. Jon raised steel against a sworn brother and spilled his life into snow. But this act, born in sorrow, was the very liturgy of the oath, signed by Corin's command and sealed by Jon's tears. If the oath has a right to anything, it is to servants ready to look monstrous that it may appear merciful. To count this as apostasy is to mistake obedience with a tragic face for treason with a satisfied one. The gods judge the heart. The watch judges the outcome. The outcome was a spy in the enemy's tent and a path back to duty. It is in the cave of warmth that the oath first slipped. The vow forbids wives and children, not the flesh itself. The watch has always tolerated the dwindling solace of Mole's Town and the blunted comforts of men who know they will leave no sons to remember their names. Yet there is a difference between an appetite and a covenant of the heart. In the steam and basalt, with a spearwife whose laughter mocked the south and whose tenderness mocked death, Jon let the watch recede. It was not law he broke so much as a posture, the habit of putting the wall before the world, of treating his own desires as whether to be endured, not windows to be opened. The boy in him became a man by a fire that belonged to an enemy who did not feel like an enemy anymore. The cave was not treason. It was a rehearsal for something more dangerous, a willingness to believe that the oath's sharp corners could be rounded by sincerity. He thought truth to oneself and truth to the watch were the same truth spoken in different rooms. Men who lead must learn the opposite lesson, that truth fractures, and leadership is the art of deciding which shard cuts least. When he returned to the wall, arrow-wounded by the same hands that had wordlessly baptized him into a different kind of life, he crawled home to the oath and wore it again. Here his defenders rest their first heavy argument. The man who returns from temptation to duty is not an apostate but a penitent. Grant him the penance and redeem the office he now undertakes. There is sense in this. He refused a southern crown in exchange for a sterner one made of frost and silence. He stood against friends for the sake of brothers. He resisted Stannis's red fire with the chill patience of a man who believes some laws should not be rewritten even by kings. As Lord Commander, he used the oath like a cup to cradle water that would otherwise have spilled. He poured the free folk through it into the realm and swore that the brothers in black were guardians of life, not guardians of a line on a map. If the oath was a bridge, he widened it. If it was a wall, he cut doors into it. This was a reform of genius in concept and hubris in tempo. He asked men to believe that bread baked for centuries in one oven could suddenly be baked in another, with new salt, and taste the same. When hunger is near, you do not change recipes without warning the kitchen. The letter that undid him, whether pink with insult in one telling or heavy with a sister's name in another, was a summons not simply to war but to an old self. The oath commands that a brother live and die at his post. The custom that grew around it commands that the watch take no part in the South's quarrels. Jon knew both. He also knew the voice of blood, that private arithmetic which miscounts on purpose so that one face matters more than 100 lives. He dressed that arithmetic in a policy, as reformers often do. The bastard of Bolton would skin the North until it did not even know it had been a country, and in such a North the watch would perish by inches. Therefore, ride. Therefore, break a rule to save the rule-maker. But on the night he called the banners, he ceased to be the Lord Commander of an order and became the captain of a cause. The knives that answered him were liturgy as much as murder, for the watch. A declaration that his brothers believed themselves to be executing not a man but an infection. The paradox here is cruel and neat. His oath, misunderstood by those who shared it, killed him for trying to save a world in which it might still be spoken later with meaning. Death is the cleverest lawyer. On the scaffold of the gods, the man who dies at his post has fulfilled the oath, and the man who rises again is a new client with no contract. So reasoned Jon Snow when breath returned. So reasoned, too, those who wished him either free of the watch or safely far from its politics. "My watch is ended," he said, and law, being a creature of syllables, could not answer. Morality could, and did, in whispers. Is the oath a transaction between a man and his life, or a vow between a soul and a service? If the first, then Jon walked clean. If the second, then he exploited a loophole written by a god who did not intend to see it used. The men who had killed him made the verdict simpler. A brother murdered at his own hearth acquires the right to leave it. Even so, the precedent is a dangerous fluid. The vow declares itself for all nights to come. If a single night's dark can be broken by a miracle and the bond set aside at sunrise, then the oath is a house one can sell back to the builder when the roof leaks. Leaders do not merely seek absolution. They teach their followers what absolution looks like. His exit taught a lesson some later would repeat in softer forms. When cause and oath collide, the cause may be declared the true oath, and the oath an old shirt to be draped over a chair. What followed was family, and family is the enemy of institutions because it is the oldest institution. The sister who had taught herself to trust no one asked him to become once more the kind of man who trusts too quickly when blood is involved. The banners he had vacated gathered to him as if iron filings to a magnet hidden under the table. He rode south from a duty that had at last learned to live without him and into a war born not of policy but of a household's memory. He did not pretend otherwise. In this, there is a bare-knuckled honesty that makes cynics uncomfortable. He did in daylight what others do at night and call pragmatism. Yet the cost in doctrine was exact. The Night's Watch became, by that act, a staging ground rather than a monastery, a way station for great men on their way to larger rooms. Later, when the ashes of a capital city made the air taste of coins, we would send him back to that way station as penance. The circle would close like a noose made of old words. There is also the oath he swore later, the knee he bent to fire. This is not the black oath, but it is kin to it. A public promise of service, made not to an abstraction like the wall but to a woman who made herself the world's sharpest instrument. When he killed her, because mercy had no other exit, he broke that second vow to preserve the spirit of every vow that claims to serve life. A philosopher of courts would forgive him entirely and write a treatise called On the Lawful Tyrannicide by the Lawful Vassal. The simpler truth is uglier. The realm survived because he learned at last to treat an oath as a means rather than an altar. He violated fealty to keep fidelity to mankind. The price was banishment dressed as restoration, return to the black, to the cold sentence he had once declared closed. The realm, inventive as ever, solved its riddles with irony. So was he, then, a breaker of oaths for personal reasons? Yes, when the personal was the Stark blood that called him to a plain outside Winterfell. Yes, when the personal was the boy who wanted to prove to an older dead man in a crypt that he had not been born for comfort. But more often he broke oaths for impersonal reasons that his opponents could not read. The mathematics of famine, the geometry of ice, the certainty that the dead do not negotiate. The trouble is that men cannot follow impersonal reasons unless they are delivered in personal language, and Jon spoke that language only sometimes. He tried to be a transparent river through which everyone could see the stones. Leaders must, on occasion, be reservoirs, deep, dark, holding back flood or famine so that others may drink without staring into the mechanics of drought. When the flood came, he opened the gates and let the valley save itself, and in this act some saw love and others saw lawlessness. If we imagine a Jon who had never broken the oath, we imagine a dead man with clean hands. Castle black sealed to the world screams, wildlings frozen into statues while a tidy doctrine survived in a monastery whose fires burned in empty halls. If we imagine a Jon who broke it earlier and more completely, we imagine a lordling with warm halls and cold borders, a hero of songs and a failure of winters. He attempted the thinnest bridge, break little, late, and only where love tugged him. This made him inconsistent in the eyes of those who judge leadership by liturgy, and indecisive in the mouths of those who judge leadership by results alone. He moved when forced, and each movement was costly because it was late. He paused when principle told him to pause, and each pause was costly because the world outside did not. Yet if we acquit him by comparing him to oathbreakers whose perfidy built towers of bones, Bolton at a wedding table, Fry at a crossing, kings who set cities alight so that their names might be seen from the sea, we cheat our scales. The question is not whether he was better than monsters. The question is whether the oath that made him was weakened by the man who found in it something to both save and set aside. The watch survived his choices, if barely. Its idea endured in a form more merciful and less martial, an order that guarded not a line but a people. That is a bending of an oath, not its breaking. The break came when he left, whether by lawful death or clever doctrine, to answer blood with banners. That was personal. That was a lesson to his followers that even a saint may dismiss the sermon when the church bell tolls his family's name. And once that lesson is taught, it is hard to unteach. He ended as men like him must, with a cloak on his shoulders and a road under his feet that did not return to a chair. If he broke oaths, he paid with loneliness. If he kept them, he paid with blood. Leadership in such winters is a market where every coin is blood or loneliness, and you are lucky to pay in only one. He paid both. Whether that makes him the worst leader depends on whether you think leadership is the maintenance of a wall or the preservation of the warm breath behind it. He sometimes failed at the first to succeed at the second. He sometimes succeeded at the first and found the second thinning between his fingers. That is the texture of tragedy, not villainy. Alliances are surgeries performed without anesthesia, and the patient is always the future. When Jon Snow set foot on Dragonstone, he brought with him a wound the world could not see, a debt to the living that the North alone could not pay. The Wall had taught him the name of the knight's arithmetic. The Snows had taught him that even courage must be multiplied to be felt. He climbed the steps under the gaze of a queen bred in exile to make oaths her ladder, and he carried not a crown in his pocket but a plea. Help me save a world that will never sing your name if we fail. This was not an act of groveling. It was a recognition that winter had translated justice into horsepower, grain into dragonfire, and prayer into logistics. The raven he sent had said as much in spare syllables. Yet in the chamber where wind and ambition twist the candles, principles become instruments even when they hum the tune of virtue. She asked for fealty as the price of her fire, and he measured the coin of his people against the scales of annihilation. If there is a nobler bargaining chip than one's pride, the chronicles have not found it. He held out for a time. He had learned at the Wall that vows do not bend without warping souls, but the ice beyond the world bent him. By the time the dragon's shadow fell over a frozen lake to snatch him from a death that wore a king's face, gratitude had already become policy. He bent the knee, and in kneeling he divided a country that had just learned to call him its center. This was not a betrayal in his own grammar. It was the continuation of a sentence he had spoken on the Wall, that the living must live. Yet the North writes in a different hand. To men and women who had dragged carts through famine and nail-walked the lattice of Bolton terror, king in the North was not a flourish, It was the first sip after thirst. They had endowed the title with a sacrament of revenge and recovery, not with the transnational ethic that Jon carried like a pilgrim's staff. When he surrendered the crown for Dragonfire, he imagined the North would feel itself ennobled by joining a cause large enough to dwarf its own ruin. Instead, it felt itself pawned, its hard-won name given away in a salt spray chamber to a queen whose claim was an old song sung far from their hearths. He had not prepared them for this trade. Leadership that breaks a people's story must offer them a better one at once. He offered them truth and necessity. They wanted myth and honor. Between those needs fell a silence where seeds of resistance took root. There is a defense for him that no honest chronicler will deny. The dead were a shadow larger than dynasties, and only Dragonfire could carve light through it fast enough to matter. His grateful oath bought a weapon of the right kind at the right hour. But he paid more than he knew. What he bought in fire he sold in authority. His voice, once the North's heartbeat, became another instrument in a southern orchestra. And though he struck pure notes, they resonated now inside a chamber tuned to a different queen's ambition. That chamber would decide which notes became policy and which were praised as noble music after they had been ignored. In seeking proof for unbelievers, he bartered risk for theater and lost a third of the rarest asset on earth. The errand beyond the wall to acquire a single captive truth was conceived in honesty and executed in desperation. It persuaded when persuasion was a luxury and laid the foundation for catastrophe when catastrophe could not afford any foundations at all. The dragon that fell in ice did not simply die. It changed sides, and with it the long immemorial barrier that had been a god to the north. The breach at Eastwatch was not only a hole in stone, it was a rift through which consequences marched. It is not fair to lay the walls fall solely at Jon's feet. The dead needed only time, and the world had already given them ages, but the choice to court spectacle drew lines that Winter would later use like ropes. Jon's defenders will answer that without that spectacle, southern petty kings and queens would not have believed in time to save anyone. Perhaps. Yet if the play saves a city by burning a kingdom's dearest inheritance, the director must own both applause and ashes. The alliance warmed more than battlefields. In council and in corridors, in the intimacy born of survival and the austerity born of both their ruined childhoods, Jon and the Dragon Queen found in each other a likeness that made trust feel like destiny. It is not our work to sneer at this. Affection untainted by calculation is rare in palaces. But in a world where the breath of one man can steer 1,000, private tenderness becomes public law. When he emerged from the sea salted and shivering, this trust hardened. When he bent the knee, it took the shape of policy. When he affirmed his choice before friend and foe alike, it became a bell that no hand could unring. The dragon pit parley demanded from him a momentary silence so that a greater peace might be spoken by others. He refused silence. He spoke truth he owed fealty already, and in speaking it broke a sort of spell that might have forced a liar into a smaller act of lying. The union against the night was stitched back together, it is true, but the thread had to be bargained in private by a man whose genius was bargains, not wars. And bargains struck in secret returned to the table like debts. They come looking for more blood than they were promised. The consequences of his candor propagated through time like cracks through winter glass. The queen's enemies measured the limits of her patience and the geometry of her pride. Her friends recalibrated their illusions about persuading her with the instruments of statesmanship alone. In the north, Jon's straightforward confession to his sisters about his birth, told under a tree that remembers and to hearts that could not forget, made them custodians of a secret too heavy to be kept in rooms where politics eat sleep. The revelation percolated to counselors who believed, as Jon did not, that prevention is the highest kindness. The whisper moved like a scout ahead of an army and found a mind trained to act when words fail. Thus were sparks placed in straw around the Dragon Queen at precisely the hour when her own losses, Yora, who steadied her heart, Missandei, who softened it, Regal, whose death told her the world would not spare even her sky, had narrowed her to a single burning line. She looked at Jon and saw not a branch to cling to but a storm she could neither rule nor trust. If he had not been the truth he was, she might have been another truth longer. This is a cruelty of history. Virtues throw shadows when the sun moves. One may say that he could not have foreseen her descent. It is unkind to pretend that men are seers simply because we read them after the fact. Yet some signs require not prophecy but sight. At the loot field she had scorched the stubborn not as a necessary battle but as a demonstration of dominion. She burned father and son who would not kneel, not because flames were demanded by logic but because symbols were demanded by rule. Jon watched that fire with the quiet of a man who confuses disapproval with dissent. He had needed her fire against a colder enemy. He did not interrogate what that fire would become when the cold was gone. He proceeded as if winter were the only tribunal worth fearing and spring would be a republic of gratitude. In this he was not naive as a boy is naive. He was naive as a monk is, convinced that sincerity is its own architecture. Something stronger is required in palaces. A carpentry of character that predicts how love and loss shape a ruler's hand. He misjudged the wood. When the march on King's Landing began in earnest, Jon's renown had become a lever used by hands he could not control. Northern men who would not have followed the dragon banner walked because the wolf walked beside it. City folk who would never have taken refuge beneath a foreign queen looked at him and thought, perhaps, that there might be a season of decency after the storm. He lent her not only swords but a grammar of hope. And while a better man's prestige can elevate a worse cause into temporary grace, the obligation runs both ways. He who lends must govern the use. He did not govern it. He requested restraint and believed his request a command. He begged for mercy and believed mercy would outshout grief. His authority had never been rooted in punishments. It had grown in men's hearts like moss, in quiet, through acts of fellowship and courage. Against the impatience and humiliation boiling in the Dragon Queen's blood, moss was no argument. He had influence, not control, and he mistook the one for the other until bells told the city it had survived and fire told it otherwise. The bells are history's cruelest punctuation. They say stop, and in stopping, invite all that had gathered to halt to trample the silence. When the city surrendered and the dragon did not, Jon learned that there are moments when a leader must not merely restrain his own men but interpose himself between the cause he made legitimate and the people it has decided to devour. He tried within the reach of his voice and arms. He cut down soldiers who mistook license for victory. He ordered from the saddle what morality demands and chaos barely hears. It is enough for his soul that he fought against the current he had helped to create. It is not enough for the ledger. If a man sponsors a storm to wash the plague from the fields, he must beware the houses on the hill. He cannot claim surprise when water follows gravity.